Your mind is loud, not because something is wrong with you, but because you've been looking for peace in the wrong place. You tried to silence your thoughts. You tried to control your mind. You tried to force stillness. And the more you tried, the louder it became. Ibn Arabi teaches something most people never hear. The mind was never meant to be quiet. The struggle you're in is not failure. It's a misunderstanding. Stillness doesn't arrive when thoughts stop. It arrives when the one fighting them disappears. In this video, you won't learn how to suppress your mind. You'll learn why it resists silence, why control makes it louder, and why true peace appears only when effort ends. If you've been exhausted by your own thinking, if silence feels close but unreachable, then this message is for you. Stay with me, because once you see what Ibn Arabi saw, you will never fight your mind again. 1. The mind was never meant to be silent. Ibn Arabi begins with a truth that feels almost uncomfortable to hear. The mind was never created to be quiet. The very nature of the intellect is movement. It categorizes, analyzes, compares, remembers, anticipates. Expecting silence from it is like standing beside the ocean and demanding the waves stop. The noise you hear is not a defect. It is the mind functioning exactly as it was designed to function. Most people suffer, not because their minds are loud, but because they are fighting a battle that cannot be won. They sit in stillness, waiting for thoughts to disappear. And when they don't, frustration grows. That frustration creates tension, and tension multiplies noise. What began as simple mental activity turns into exhaustion, guilt, and self-judgment. Ibn Arabi would say, this suffering is not caused by the mind itself, but by false expectations placed upon it. The mistake is believing that inner peace is the absence of thought. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that peace is not located in silence, but in right placement. The mind is a tool, not a home. It was never meant to be the place where you live. When a tool is mistaken for an identity, it begins to dominate. Thoughts then feel personal, urgent, and uncontrollable. You are no longer using the mind. The mind is using you. This is why the more desperately someone tries to quiet their thoughts, the louder those thoughts seem to become. Effort feeds resistance, and resistance fuels inner noise. Ibn Arabi points out that the mind grows restless when it is placed in a role it cannot fulfill. Asking it to provide stillness is like asking fire to cool you. It simply cannot do what it is not made for. True relief begins the moment you understand this, not intellectually, but inwardly. When you stop demanding silence from the mind, a subtle shift occurs. The inner pressure dissolves. The constant self-correction relaxes. You are no longer watching your thoughts with hostility, trying to erase them. Instead, you allow them to pass like weather across the sky of awareness. And here is the paradox Ibn ʿArabi reveals. When you stop demanding silence, the mind naturally softens. Not because you controlled it, but because you removed the conflict. Stillness does not arrive through force. It arrives through understanding. When the mind is no longer blamed, it no longer needs to defend itself with noise. This lesson alone changes everything. It reframes the entire spiritual struggle. You realize that peace was never about muting the mind, disciplining thoughts, or reaching a blank state. It was about stepping out of the wrong relationship with thinking itself. The mind continues to move, but it no longer dominates your inner world. In Ibn Arabi's teaching, the first door to stillness opens not through effort, but through clarity. When you finally see that the mind was never meant to be silent, you stop fighting it. And the moment the fight ends, the path to true stillness quietly begins. 2. The mind becomes loud when you mistake it for who you are. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that the greatest source of inner noise is not thinking itself, but misidentification. The mind becomes unbearable only when you believe it is you. The moment thoughts are treated as identity rather than activity, every idea feels personal, every fear feels urgent, and every passing emotion feels like a threat to your existence. Noise intensifies, not because thoughts increase, but because attachment deepens. When a thought arises and you believe, "This is me," the mind tightens. It must now defend, justify, explain, and protect that thought. One idea calls another, one fear invites 10 more. The mind begins to speak endlessly because it believes it is responsible for maintaining who you are. Ibn ʿArabi explains that the mind grows restless when it is burdened with identity. It was never meant to carry the weight of the self. This is why two people can experience the same thought, yet only one suffers. The difference is not the thought, it is the relationship to it. One observes the thought and lets it pass. The other enters it, argues with it, fears it, and builds a story around it. The noise is not created by thinking, but by belonging to thought. Ibn ʿArabi's insight is subtle but powerful. When you identify with the mind, you give it authority over your inner state. It becomes the ruler instead of the servant. Every opinion must be defended. Every memory must be relived. Every imagined future must be controlled. The mind grows louder because it is trying to hold together a false center. The moment awareness shifts, everything changes. When you begin to see thoughts as events rather than identities, distance appears. That distance is not cold or detached. It is spacious and gentle. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer define you. They no longer demand action. They no longer shout for control. This is where quiet begins, not because thoughts stop, but because they lose ownership. The mind no longer has to scream to be heard, because it is no longer mistaken for the self. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that true silence begins when the witness awakens. When you recognize that you are the one aware of thought, not the thought itself, the inner atmosphere softens. And here is the deeper truth. The mind resists silence when it believes it must preserve identity. But when identity is released from thought, the mind relaxes. It no longer needs to narrate every moment. It no longer needs to justify your worth or predict your survival. Its job becomes simple again. This lesson cuts at the root of inner suffering. You do not need to purify the mind or cleanse it of thoughts. You only need to stop confusing movement with meaning. The mind moves. Awareness remains. When that distinction becomes clear, the noise that once felt overwhelming begins to lose its grip. In Ibn ʿArabi's path, quieting the mind does not start with discipline. It starts with right knowing who you are and who you are not. When that knowledge settles, the mind no longer needs to shout to exist. 3. Stillness does not belong to the mind, it belongs to the heart. Ibn ʿArabi makes a distinction so profound that most seekers miss it entirely. Stillness is not a function of the mind at all. The reason so many people fail to find peace is because they are searching for it in the wrong place. They sit inside the intellect, demanding calm from something whose very nature is movement. And when calm does not appear, they assume something is wrong with them. The mind was created to move. It travels between memory and anticipation, between comparison and interpretation. It survives by motion. Asking the mind to be still is like asking the wind to stop being air. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that the real seat of stillness is not the intellect, but the heart. And until this is understood, the seeker remains trapped in effort, frustration, and disappointment. In Sufi understanding, the heart is not merely emotional. It is the center of direct knowing. It does not analyze reality, it receives it. The heart is present where the mind is restless. When awareness lives in the mind, Life is filtered through constant commentary. Every moment is judged, labeled, measured, and interpreted. This endless interpretation creates inner noise. The heart, by contrast, does not argue with reality. It rests in it. This is why moments of deep presence feel quiet, even when thoughts are still occurring. The quiet does not come from the absence of thought, but from the absence of dominance. When the heart is active, the mind loses its authority. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer occupy the center of experience. They move on the surface, while awareness rests deeper. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that most inner turmoil comes from placing leadership in the wrong faculty. When the mind leads, life feels heavy. Everything must be understood, controlled, or predicted. The mind begins to speak endlessly because it believes survival depends on constant vigilance. But when the heart leads, the burden lifts. There is trust, there is grounding, there is a sense of being held by something larger than thought. Many people attempt to quiet the mind through mental discipline, techniques, or force. They monitor their thoughts, criticize themselves for thinking, and try to replace bad thoughts with good ones. Ibn ʿArabi warns that this only strengthens the intellect's grip. Using thought to fight thought is like pouring fuel on fire. The heart cannot be reached through control. It opens through presence. When attention shifts from the mind to the heart, something subtle but decisive happens. The inner pressure eases. The urgency dissolves. The constant need to explain, justify, and evaluate begins to fade. The mind senses that it is no longer alone in holding reality together. It relaxes not because it was commanded to be quiet, but because it is no longer in charge. This is why remembrance, sincerity, and inward attentiveness have such a calming effect. They do not suppress thought, they recenter awareness. The heart becomes active, and the mind naturally takes its proper role as a servant rather than a ruler. Thoughts appear when needed and disappear when not. There is no struggle with them, no obsession with their presence or absence. Ibn ʿArabi emphasizes that true stillness cannot be manufactured. It is not achieved through effort or technique. It arises when alignment is restored. When the heart becomes the axis of awareness, stillness emerges as a natural state. The seeker realizes that peace was never missing. It was simply overshadowed by misplaced attention. This lesson is gripping because it dismantles the entire idea of controlling the mind. You were never meant to conquer thought. You were meant to return to the heart. And when you do, the noise that once felt overwhelming begins to lose its power. The mind continues to move, but it no longer disturbs the depth beneath it. In Ibn ʿArabi's path, peace is not something you achieve. It is something you uncover by standing in the right place. When awareness rests in the heart, stillness reveals itself, not as silence, but as a deep, unshakable calm that was always there. 4. The mind grows loud when you live outside the present moment. Ibn ʿArabi reveals that the mind does not become noisy without a reason. Its restlessness is a response to something far deeper, the absence of awareness from the present moment. The mind speaks the loudest when you are no longer fully here. When attention drifts away from what is real, the intellect rushes in to compensate. It fills the gap with memories, predictions, explanations, and fears. Noise is not the problem. Displacement is. The present moment is simple. It does not demand interpretation. It does not need improvement. It simply exists. The mind, however, thrives on complexity. When awareness abandons the present, the mind immediately begins to construct an alternate reality. It replays what has already happened, trying to fix it. It imagines what might happen next, trying to control it. This endless activity creates the sense of inner chaos so many people experience. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that the mind becomes loud when it believes it must replace reality. When you are not fully present, the intellect steps in as a substitute. It narrates life instead of letting it be lived. It explains, judges, and predicts because it assumes awareness is no longer holding the moment. The noise is the mind trying to protect you from absence. This is why regret and anxiety are such powerful sources of mental disturbance. Regret pulls you backward into what no longer exists. Anxiety pushes you forward into what has not yet arrived. In both cases, you leave the only place where peace is possible. The mind then becomes hyperactive because it believes it must manage time itself. It tries to repair the past and secure the future, even though neither can be touched. Stillness, Ibn ʿArabi explains, is not found by silencing thought, but by returning to what is. When awareness settles fully in the present moment, thought loses its urgency. The mind has nothing to defend and nothing to correct. It softens naturally because its purpose becomes clear again. It is no longer the keeper of reality, only a servant of it. Many seekers misunderstand presence, believing it to be a special state that must be reached through effort. Ibn ʿArabi dismantles this idea completely. Presence is not something you achieve. It is something you stop abandoning. You are already here. The problem is not arrival, but distraction. When attention stops fleeing into stories, the present reveals its quiet power. This teaching is gripping because it removes the struggle from the path. You do not need to monitor every thought or battle the mind into submission. You only need to notice where your attention has gone. The moment you return to now, to what is happening rather than what might happen, the mind begins to calm on its own. The intellect was never meant to carry the weight of time. When it tries to do so, it becomes restless and loud. Ibn ʿArabi shows that the mind finds peace not through control, but through trust in the present. When awareness rests fully here, the mind no longer needs to shout. It becomes clear, functional, and quiet in its proper role. In this lesson, Ibn ʿArabi reveals that inner noise is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a signal to be understood. It is a reminder that attention has drifted. When you respond not by fighting thought, but by returning to presence, stillness begins to emerge naturally. Peace is not hidden in silence. It is found in being fully here. 5. The more you try to control the mind, the more it resists. Ibn ʿArabi delivers one of the most unsettling truths for seekers. The mind cannot be controlled into peace. In fact, the very attempt to control it is what amplifies its rebellion. Most inner turmoil is not caused by thought itself, but by the struggle against thought. The louder the demand for silence, the louder the resistance becomes. From a Sufi perspective, control is a subtle form of fear. When you try to dominate the mind, you are quietly admitting that you do not trust what will happen if you don't. The mind senses this mistrust, and because it believes it must protect you, it tightens its grip. It produces more thoughts, more warnings, more commentary. What you experience as chaos is often the mind responding to pressure. Ibn ʿArabi explains that the mind was never meant to be ruled by force. It was meant to be understood. When force is applied inwardly, the ego becomes active, and wherever the ego is active, noise multiplies. The ego thrives on management, correction, and self-monitoring. It constantly asks, "Am I doing this right?" That question alone can generate endless mental movement. This is why so many people feel exhausted after trying to meditate or quiet their thoughts. They sit with a hidden agenda. Silence must happen. When it doesn't, frustration arises. That frustration creates another layer of thought, another loop of judgment. The seeker begins fighting the very activity they wish to escape. Ibn ʿArabi would say this is not spiritual work, it is internal warfare. The deeper teaching here is this: the mind resists control because it was never meant to be the master nor the enemy. It becomes unruly only when it is treated as something that must be conquered. The more you tighten your grip, the more it struggles for freedom. This struggle is experienced as restlessness, anxiety, and constant inner dialogue. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that observation dissolves what control cannot. When thoughts are watched without interference, they lose momentum, not immediately and not dramatically, but inevitably. A thought that is not fed by reaction completes its cycle and fades. But a thought that is resisted is strengthened, because resistance gives it energy. This is where many seekers misunderstand surrender. They think surrender means passivity or weakness. Ibn ʿArabi clarifies that surrender is clarity without interference. It is allowing the mind to move without granting it authority. When you stop trying to manage every thought, the mind slowly realizes it no longer needs to perform. There is a profound shift that occurs when control is replaced by allowance. The inner atmosphere changes. The urgency dissolves. The constant need to fix, improve, or eliminate thoughts begins to soften. The mind senses that awareness is no longer threatening it with suppression, and in that safety, it relaxes. This lesson reveals why stillness often appears when you stop chasing it. Peace emerges not when you demand it, but when you stop obstructing it. Ibn ʿArabi emphasizes that silence is not produced by discipline alone, but by trust. Trust that awareness can hold experience without micromanagement. Trust that thought does not need to be policed to pass. The mind grows loud when it feels responsible for everything. When you try to control it, you reinforce that responsibility. But when you step back into observation, the burden lifts. The mind no longer believes it must protect your identity, manage reality, or secure the future. Its role becomes smaller and quieter. This is why true stillness feels effortless when it arrives. It is not the result of domination, but of release. You did not silence the mind. You stopped wrestling with it. And in the absence of struggle, the noise naturally thins. Ibn ʿArabi's teaching here is gripping because it dismantles one of the deepest illusions on the spiritual path: the belief that peace must be achieved. Peace is not an outcome of control. It is what remains when control is no longer needed. When you finally understand this, something inside you lets go. The mind continues to function, but it no longer feels like a battlefield. Thoughts arise and pass without drama. Silence appears not as emptiness, but as a gentle spaciousness beneath everything. This lesson invites a radical shift. Stop trying to quiet the mind. Let it move. Watch it. Trust awareness. The moment you release the need to control, the very thing you were chasing begins to appear on its own. 6. Stillness appears when the doer inside you relaxes. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that beneath the noise of the mind lies a deeper source of disturbance: the inner doer. This is the part of you that is always trying to manage life, fixing, improving, controlling, correcting, and steering every inner and outer movement. As long as this doer is tense, the mind cannot rest. Not because the mind is flawed, but because it is being constantly commanded. The inner doer believes peace must be produced. It assumes that if it does not stay active, something will fall apart. So it keeps working, thinking, planning, replaying, evaluating. It asks endless questions. Am I progressing? Am I doing this right? Why is my mind still loud? Each question fuels more movement. The doer is never satisfied, because its nature is effort. Ibn ʿArabi reveals something subtle and unsettling. The doer is not the source of stillness, it is the barrier to it. Stillness does not respond to effort. It appears when effort relaxes. as long as there is someone inside trying to achieve peace. Peace remains distant, not because it is absent, but because it is being blocked. This is why many sincere seekers feel exhausted. They have turned spirituality into another task. They try to do silence. They try to perform calm. They try to maintain presence. The doer takes over the path and turns it into labor. Ibn ʿArabi would say that this is not surrender, it is disguised control. The mind becomes loud because the doer keeps activating it. Every attempt to improve inner experience requires thought. Every effort to hold a state requires vigilance. The mind is recruited again and again to serve the doer's agenda. And so the noise continues, not because the mind refuses peace, but because it is being constantly employed. The gripping insight Ibn ʿArabi offers is this: peace does not arrive when you succeed. At doing it arrives when the doer steps aside. This does not mean passivity or neglect. It means releasing the inner demand that something must happen. When the doer relaxes, awareness opens. And when awareness opens, the mind no longer needs to perform. There is a moment, often unexpected, when effort drops. It may happen in prayer, in reflection, or even in exhaustion. The seeker stops trying, and suddenly, without warning, there is quiet, not forced, not dramatic, just present. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that this moment reveals a profound truth. Stillness was never created, it was uncovered. The doer resists this because it fears disappearance. It believes that if it stops acting, identity will collapse. But Ibn ʿArabi shows that what collapses is not the self, but the illusion of control. What remains is something deeper, steadier, and far more peaceful than effort could ever produce. When the doer relaxes, the mind senses it no longer needs to maintain order. It no longer needs to narrate every experience. It no longer needs to solve existence. The burden lifts. Thoughts slow naturally, not because they are suppressed, but because their commander has stepped down. This lesson is gripping because it explains why peace so often arrives after surrender, not before it. Why moments of stillness appear when you stop trying to fix yourself. Why silence visits when you are no longer demanding it. Ibn ʿArabi makes it clear. The mind quiets when the inner controller loosens its grip. The deepest shift happens when you realize that awareness does not need management. Life does not need constant inner supervision. Reality is already unfolding without your mental interference. When the doer trusts this, it relaxes, and in that relaxation, the mind follows. Ibn ʿArabi's teaching here is radical because it removes the final obstacle. You stop trying to arrive somewhere inwardly. You stop measuring progress. You stop chasing states. You allow what is already present to reveal itself. Stillness, then, is not something you earn. It is what remains when the one who is trying finally rests. When the doer relaxes, the mind softens. And when the mind softens, a deep, unforced quiet begins to spread. Steady, grounded, and unmistakably real. 7. True stillness is a gift, not a technique. Ibn ʿArabi brings the journey to its most decisive realization. Stillness is not something you manufacture. It is something that visits you. Every technique, every method, every disciplined effort ultimately reaches a point where it must fall away. Not because it failed, but because it has taken you as far as effort can go. Beyond that threshold, stillness appears only as a gift. This teaching unsettles the modern seeker because it removes the final illusion of control. We want formulas. We want repeatable steps. We want guarantees. But Ibn ʿArabi insists that the deepest peace cannot be commanded. It arrives when the inner conditions are aligned, often quietly, unexpectedly, without announcement. Stillness is not the reward for perfect practice. It is the response to sincerity and surrender. The mind struggles with this because it is built on cause and effect. It believes that if the right inputs are applied, the right outcome must follow. But stillness does not obey the logic of production. The more you chase it as an outcome, the more it recedes. Not out of cruelty, but because chasing itself creates tension, and tension is incompatible with peace. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that when a seeker becomes obsessed with methods, the heart becomes secondary. Practice turns into performance. Presence turns into pressure. The seeker begins to ask, why hasn't it happened yet? What am I doing wrong? These questions reactivate the mind and strengthen the ego. The very pursuit of peace becomes the obstacle to it. True stillness appears when the seeker stops negotiating with reality. When prayer is no longer a transaction, when remembrance is no longer a tool, when silence is no longer demanded. At that point, something profound occurs. The inner posture changes. There is no longer a seeker chasing an experience. There is simply openness. This is why Ibn ʿArabi emphasizes alignment over achievement. When the heart is sincere, when the ego loosens, when the doer relaxes, and when presence is restored, stillness recognizes its place. It does not need to be summoned. It arrives naturally, like calm water once the storm has passed. Many people mistake this teaching as passive or discouraging. In reality, it is deeply liberating. It means you are not failing because peace has not appeared on command. It means nothing is broken. It means you were never meant to produce stillness. You were meant to make room for it. Stillness, Ibn ʿArabi teaches, is closer than effort. It is not hidden behind years of struggle. It is revealed when struggle ends. This is why moments of deep quiet often arrive after surrender, after loss, after exhaustion, when the ego can no longer maintain control. The heart opens, and peace enters without resistance. There is a profound humility in this lesson. It reminds the seeker that peace is not a personal achievement. It is a grace, and grace cannot be forced. It can only be received. When this is understood, the entire inner struggle softens. You stop chasing experiences. You stop comparing states. You stop measuring progress. The mind, sensing that it is no longer responsible for producing peace, finally rests. It no longer needs to optimize, analyze, or correct the moment. It returns to its rightful role as a servant, not a master. Thought becomes functional rather than obsessive. Silence becomes spacious rather than strained. Ibn ʿArabi's final lesson is gripping because it releases the seeker from the last trap, the belief that awakening must be earned. Stillness does not belong to effort. It belongs to openness. When the inner conditions are right, it arrives as naturally as breath. This is where the path ends, not in triumph, but in simplicity. You realize that peace was never distant. It was only waiting for you to stop trying to seize it. When you finally let go, stillness does not feel dramatic. It feels familiar, like something you had always known, but forgotten. In the end, Ibn ʿArabi leaves the seeker with a quiet truth. You do not enter stillness. Stillness enters you. And when it does, the mind no longer needs to be quieted. It rests because it finally trusts that peace is no longer its job to create. If your mind is quiet right now, do not try to hold it. If it is still loud, do not try to fix it. Ibn ʿArabi reminds us that peace was never something to achieve. It was something to remember. The mind was never your enemy. It only became restless when it was asked to do what it was never created for. Stillness does not arrive through force. It arrives when effort softens, when control relaxes, when presence returns. So don't leave this moment in a rush. Sit with it. Let the teaching settle without turning it into another task. And when the noise returns, as it sometimes will, remember this: You are not here to quiet the mind. You are here to rest in what is deeper than it. If this message reached you, let it stay with you. And when you return to your day, carry one simple truth. Peace does not come when the mind becomes silent. Peace comes when you stop being lost inside it. Stay present, and stillness will meet you there.